All right, have you ever really thought about the timing of some of Jesus' most famous lines? Today we're digging into a pretty critical argument that looks at the Gospel of John and asks a really provocative question. Do those famous I am statements actually make sense when he supposedly said them? Let's get into it.
So, the argument we're looking at kicks off with this pretty bold claim. It basically says that Jesus in the Gospel of John walks around like a madman. And why? Well, it's all because of these huge, sweeping I am declarations he makes. And really, this one provocative idea, it's the jumping off point for this entire critique.
Okay, so section 1, the Madman claim. This is the core idea we're going to explore. The whole argument really boils down to this. Is the version of Jesus we see in John's Gospel, with all these I am statements, is that even plausible? Let's follow the breadcrumbs.
So what's the big deal? According to this source, why are these I am statements just so unlikely? Well, it all comes down to one simple thing: timing. The whole argument is that Jesus makes these absolutely monumental claims before the crucifixion and resurrection, the very events that are supposed to give them any weight. It's kind of like a runner declaring victory before the race is even started. It just feels off.
All right, section 2 is where we'll question the I am statements themselves. Let's really dig into the specific examples this source uses to build his case. We're going to look at some of the most famous ones, one by one.
First up, we've got this one. I am the resurrection and the life. I mean, wow, that is a massive claim, right? A total declaration of ultimate power over life and death itself.
But here's the first big problem the source points out. He wasn't resurrected yet, right? So how could Jesus claim to be the resurrection when he hadn't, actually been resurrected yet? From this perspective, the claim comes way before the proof, and that creates a huge logical hurdle.
Okay, next up, the source takes on I am the way, that claim to be the one and only true path to God. This is another really profound statement, and again, the critique gets right down to timing and definition. And what's really interesting here is how the source uses another part of the Bible to make its case. It points to the book of Hebrews, which it says describes the way, not as some title a person holds, but as a path of obedience and submission that has to be walked. So in this view, Jesus hadn't even finished that journey yet.
The next example is that famous declaration, I'm the bread of life, the idea that he is our spiritual nourishment. But here's the twist. The source points out what it sees as a flat-out contradiction inside the very same book. It argues that the Gospel of John also defines the spiritual bread as the act of doing God's will. So the question becomes, which is it? Is it a title Jesus already has, or is it a task he still has to complete on the cross?
And the last example we'll look at is the title, I am the Good Shepherd, the one who leads and protects the flock. Now for this one, the argument shifts just a little bit. The source claims this title wasn't even unique to Jesus. It points out that other people, like the Apostle Peter, were also called to be shepherds. And because it's a shared role, the source argues, it kind of weakens the power of Jesus' singular I am claim.
So let's move to section 3. The timing is everything. All these specific examples we've just looked at, the resurrection, the way, the bread, the shepherd, they all point back to this one central idea in the critique. Timing is literally everything.
And this slide just lays out the whole argument perfectly. You can see it right here. On the left, you've got the I am statements being made before all the pivotal events. In the middle, you have what the source calls the victory, the cross and resurrection. The entire point is that these grand, sweeping claims would only really make sense after this victory was achieved, looking back on it from a later perspective.
Okay, section 4. John vs. the Synoptics. Now we're getting to what this source considers its most powerful piece of evidence. This isn't just about what's inside the Gospel of John anymore. It's about how it stacks up against the other 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The ones often called the Synoptics because they tell a very similar story. A story that, according to this critique, is worlds apart from what we find in John.
What the source is basically presenting us with here is a tale of 2 very different Jesuses. According to this analysis, the way he talks, the claims he makes, his entire personality, it's all dramatically different in John's Gospel compared to the others.
And this comparison is really the knockout punch for this argument. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I am the light. It's a direct, divine claim all about himself. But then you look at the other Gospels, and he turns that phrase completely around. He looks at his followers and says, you are the light. The source presents this as a fundamental split. On one hand, you have a divine figure making these huge claims. On the other, you have an empowering teacher focusing on his followers. They seem like two different people.
So that brings us to Section 5, a final judgment. After looking at the timing, the supposed internal contradictions, and that stark contrast with the other Gospels, the source is ready to deliver its final verdict on John's I am statements.
And the source's conclusion is, well, it's blunt. It calls the statements anachronistic, which basically means they're out of time, claims made way before they were proven. Then psychologically impossible, arguing that the humble teacher we see elsewhere just wouldn't talk like this. And finally, purely nonsensical, a complete and total dismissal of them being historically likely.
And so, this whole critical analysis leaves us with a massive question hanging in the air. If this argument holds any water, if the I am statements in John's Gospel really are a later addition and not the actual words of the historical Jesus, then who was the real person at the center of it all? That's a pretty profound question to chew on.